The gymnasium erupted in chaos as 17-year-old Riley Thompson executed a perfect shoulder throw, sending Madison Pierce crashing to the mat with a sickening thud that echoed through the packed bleachers. What started as cruel humiliation in a hallway at Riverside High had transformed into something none of these bullies saw coming. A quiet girl who had been hiding black belt judo skills for 3 years was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The same hands that had been violated and humiliated just hours earlier were now weapons of precision, and Madison's screams for help would be heard by the entire school. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Riley Thompson had mastered the art of invisibility at Riverside High School. At 17, she moved through the crowded hallways of the sprawling Oregon campus like a ghost, her dark auburn hair always pulled back in a simple ponytail, her green eyes consistently focused on the worn linoleum beneath her feet. While her classmates navigated the complex social hierarchies of high school with practiced ease, Riley found solace in the margins, carrying her well-worn copy of The Art of War tucked inside her backpack alongside textbooks that most students barely opened. Millbrook, Oregon was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business. A community of 40,000 nestled between rolling hills and dense forests where the biggest excitement usually centered around Friday night football games and the annual Harvest Festival. Riverside High reflected this small-town atmosphere perfectly, a place where reputation mattered more than reality, where being different was often synonymous with being a target, and where the wrong move could follow you for years. But Riley harbored a secret that set her apart from every other quiet kid who had ever walked these halls. 3 times a week, when the final bell released students into their afternoon routines of sports practice and social gatherings, Riley would slip away to the Riverside Community Dojo, a modest building tucked behind the town's main shopping district. There, under the watchful eye of Sensei Catherine Nakamura, Riley had been transforming herself from timid teenager into something far more dangerous. Sensei Kate, as she preferred to be called, was a compact woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked black hair and eyes that seemed to see through pretense. She had competed internationally in judo during her 20s, earning medals that now hung modestly in the dojo's small office, before settling in Millbrook to teach the ancient art to a handful of dedicated students. When Riley first stumbled into the dojo 3 years ago, bruised from yet another encounter with school bullies, Sensei Kate recognized something special in the withdrawn girl. Riley's transformation had been gradual but profound. The girl who once flinched at raised voices now moved with fluid grace, her body learning to harness momentum and leverage in ways that defied her slight frame. She absorbed the philosophical aspects of judo with the same intensity as the physical techniques, understanding that true strength came not from aggression but from using an opponent's force against them. The dojo had become her sanctuary, the one place where she felt truly powerful, truly herself. At home, Riley's secret remained hidden even from her family. Her parents, both nurses who worked long shifts at Millbrook General Hospital, barely noticed their daughter's after-school disappearances. Her older brother Jake, a sophomore at Oregon State University, was too focused on his engineering studies to pay attention to his sister's mysterious new confidence. Riley preferred it this way. The dojo was hers alone, a world where she could be strong without having to explain or justify that strength to anyone. The student body at Riverside High operated under an unspoken but rigidly enforced caste system. At the top sat the golden ones, the star athletes, the homecoming royalty, the students whose parents funded the school's booster clubs and whose college acceptance letters were already guaranteed. Below them stretched various tiers of social acceptability, each group carefully maintaining their position through a complex web of relationships, achievements, and carefully cultivated images. Riley existed in the spaces between these groups, not quite invisible enough to be completely ignored but not significant enough to be considered a threat. She earned solid grades without being labeled a brain, participated in required activities without drawing attention to herself, and had perfected the art of being present without being noticed. This delicate balance had served her well for most of her high school career, allowing her to avoid the worst of the social warfare that claimed so many casualties among her peers. Madison Pierce ruled the upper echelons of Riverside High's social hierarchy with the casual cruelty of someone who had never questioned her own privilege. The 17-year-old daughter of Millbrook's most successful real estate developer, Madison possessed the kind of effortless beauty that made adults smile indulgently at her minor transgressions, while making her peers desperate for her approval. Her blonde hair always fell in perfect waves, her designer clothes never showed wrinkles, and her smile could shift from warm to venomous in the space of a heartbeat. Madison's inner circle consisted of two equally privileged girls who had attached themselves to her rising star early in elementary school and never looked back. Chloe Reynolds, the daughter of the town's only plastic surgeon, served as Madison's digital lieutenant, documenting their lives through carefully curated social media posts that made their existence seem like a perpetual celebration. Chloe's talent for capturing the perfect angle, the ideal lighting, the most flattering moment had made her indispensable to Madison's image management. Amber Walsh completed the trio, bringing a different kind of value to their group dynamic. Where Madison provided the vision and Chloe handled the documentation, Amber served as the enforcer, the one willing to get her hands dirty when situations required more direct action. The daughter of a construction company owner, Amber possessed a physical presence that complemented her willingness to cross lines that Madison preferred to avoid crossing herself. Together, these three girls had spent their high school years perfecting the art of social dominance. They understood instinctively that true power came not from being liked but from being feared, not from inclusion but from the ability to exclude. They had elevated bullying to an art form, using social media, whisper campaigns, and carefully orchestrated public humiliations to maintain their position at the top of Riverside High's food chain. Their reign had been largely unopposed because they chose their targets carefully, focusing on students who lacked the social connections or family influence to fight back effectively. Teachers often looked the other way, either intimidated by the girls' family connections or simply unwilling to get involved in what they dismissed as typical teenage drama. The administration, led by Principal Martinez, preferred to maintain the fiction that Riverside High was a harmonious community where such problems didn't exist. For 3 years, Riley had successfully avoided becoming a target of Madison's attention. She had learned to read the social weather, to anticipate when storms were brewing, and position herself safely out of their path. Her strategy had been simple but effective: remain unremarkable, avoid anything that might draw attention, and never give Madison or her friends a reason to notice her existence. But strategies, no matter how carefully crafted, can be undone by a single moment of carelessness, a split second when the universe shifts and all the careful planning becomes irrelevant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For Riley Thompson, that moment came on a cold November morning when the Oregon rain had turned the hallways of Riverside High into a maze of slippery floors and crowded corridors. Riley had been hurrying to her first period chemistry class, her mind focused on the quiz she hadn't studied for the night before, when she rounded the corner near the East Wing lockers and collided directly with Madison Pierce. The impact sent Madison's expensive coffee drink flying, the contents splashing across her pristine white sweater and onto her designer shoes. Time seemed to freeze as both girls stared at the spreading stain, the sweet smell of vanilla latte hanging in the air between them. Madison's face transformed in an instant, her practiced smile melting away to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. Around them, other students stopped their conversations to watch, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Riley found herself the center of attention for the first time in her high school career, and she immediately understood that this was exactly where she had never wanted to be. The apology tumbled from Riley's lips before she could stop it, words of genuine remorse mixed with growing panic as she realized the magnitude of what had just happened. She fumbled in her backpack for napkins, tissues, anything that might help clean up the mess. But Madison stepped back as if Riley's proximity might somehow make the situation worse. Chloe appeared at Madison's side within seconds, her phone already out and recording, while Amber moved to flank Riley from the other direction. The three girls had worked together for so long that their movements seemed choreographed, each one instinctively taking their assigned position in what was clearly a well-rehearsed routine. Madison's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the kind of quiet authority that made the surrounding hallway fall silent. She didn't shout or scream. She didn't need to. Everyone within earshot understood that they were witnessing the beginning of something that would define someone's high school experience for better or worse. The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal in its efficiency. Madison's words were chosen with surgical precision, each one designed to cut deep while maintaining the facade of injured innocence. She spoke about clumsiness, about people who couldn't watch where they were going, about the kind of students who made Riverside High a less pleasant place for everyone. Her tone remained conversational, almost friendly, but every word carried the weight of social judgment. Riley stood frozen in the center of the growing crowd, her face burning with embarrassment as she realized that her 3 years of careful invisibility had just been shattered in a single moment. The other students watched with the mixture of fascination and relief that comes from witnessing someone else's misfortune, grateful that they weren't the ones in Riley's position, while simultaneously unable to look away from the unfolding drama. But Madison wasn't finished. She had tasted blood, and like any skilled predator, she recognized weakness when she saw it. Riley's obvious distress, her stammered apologies, her desperate attempts to make amends, all of it confirmed what Madison had suspected about quiet students like Riley. They were easy targets, people who would absorb punishment without fighting back, who would internalize blame rather than push back against their tormentors. The crowd began to disperse as the first period bell rang, but Madison's parting words hung in the air like a promise. She would remember this moment, remember Riley's face, remember the satisfaction of watching someone crumble under social pressure. And Riley, gathering her scattered belongings with shaking hands, understood that her carefully constructed world of invisibility had just come to an end. As she hurried to chemistry class, Riley's mind raced through the implications of what had just happened. She had seen Madison's handiwork before, had watched from the sidelines as other students became targets of the popular girl's attention. She knew that this was just the beginning, that Madison would not be satisfied with a single moment of humiliation. There would be more encounters, more opportunities for degradation, more chances for Madison to demonstrate her power over someone she now perceived as weak. But what Madison Pierce didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Riley Thompson had spent the last 3 years learning how to turn weakness into strength, how to use an opponent's aggression against them, how to find power in unexpected places. The quiet girl who had just apologized so profusely for a simple accident was also the same person who could execute a perfect shoulder throw, who understood leverage and momentum in ways that most people never would. Riley took her seat in chemistry class, her hands still trembling slightly from the encounter. But somewhere beneath the embarrassment and fear, something else was beginning to stir. It was a feeling she recognized from the dojo, the calm focus that came before executing a technique, the moment when everything became clear and purposeful. She had spent 3 years learning to be invisible, but perhaps it was time to discover what it felt like to be seen. The question was whether she would have the courage to reveal the person she had become when the moment of truth arrived, or whether she would allow Madison Pierce to define her story for her. The answer to that question would come sooner than anyone expected, in a way that would change not just Riley's life, but the entire dynamic of Riverside High School. Because sometimes, the quietest people have the most to say, and sometimes the most devastating responses come from the most unexpected sources. Madison Pierce had just made the biggest mistake of her high school career, and she didn't even know it yet. The transformation in Riley's daily existence began with surgical precision. Madison Pierce had elevated psychological warfare to an art form, and her campaign against Riley unfolded with the methodical cruelty of someone who understood exactly how to dismantle another person's sense of security without leaving obvious fingerprints. It started with the whispers. Riley would enter a classroom to find conversations dying abruptly, followed by barely concealed giggles and meaningful glances. Students who had never paid her any attention suddenly seemed intensely aware of her presence, though not in any way that felt welcoming. She began to notice how groups would fall silent when she approached, how seats beside her would remain mysteriously empty, even in crowded rooms. Chloe Reynolds had weaponized social media with devastating effectiveness. Without ever mentioning Riley by name, she had crafted a series of posts that painted a picture of certain types of students who made school environments uncomfortable for others. Her carefully chosen words spoke of awkward encounters, of people who didn't understand social boundaries, of the importance of surrounding yourself with positive influences. Each post garnered hundreds of likes and shares, creating a narrative that anyone familiar with recent events could easily decode. The beauty of Chloe's approach lay in its deniability. If confronted, she could claim innocence, insisting that her posts were about general principles rather than specific individuals. But the student body understood the subtext perfectly, and Riley found herself bearing the weight of accusations that had never been explicitly made. Amber Walsh's contributions were more direct but equally calculated. She had mastered the art of the accidental collision, the perfectly timed shoulder check that sent Riley's books cascading to the floor. These incidents always occurred in crowded hallways where witnesses might dispute whether the contact was intentional, and Amber's apologies were always loud enough for others to hear, painting her as considerate while leaving Riley scrambling to collect her scattered belongings. The lockers became a particular source of torment. Riley would arrive to find her combination mysteriously altered, forcing her to seek help from maintenance staff, who clearly viewed her as an inconvenience. Sometimes the lock would work fine, but the contents would be subtly rearranged, creating the unsettling sensation that her private space had been violated even when nothing was obviously missing. Food became another battleground. Riley's lunch would disappear from the cafeteria table when she stepped away, leaving her to wonder whether she had misplaced it or whether someone had taken it deliberately. Drinks would be accidentally knocked over, soaking her homework and forcing her to explain to teachers why her assignments were damaged. These incidents happened just frequently enough to create a pattern, but not so often that they appeared systematic to casual observers. The psychological pressure was relentless and exhausting. Riley found herself constantly on guard, anticipating the next humiliation, analyzing every interaction for hidden meanings. Sleep became elusive as her mind replayed each day's encounters, searching for clues about what might be coming next. Her grades began to suffer as concentration became increasingly difficult, her thoughts scattered by the constant stress of navigating a hostile environment. Mrs. Chen, her advanced placement English teacher, noticed the change first. Riley had always been one of her most reliable students, someone who participated thoughtfully in discussions and submitted work that showed genuine engagement with the material. When Riley's contributions to class discussions dwindled to nothing, and her usually polished essays began arriving with obvious signs of rushing, Mrs. Chun tried to address the situation with gentle inquiries. But Riley had learned to deflect. concern with practiced ease. She attributed her declining performance to stress about college applications, family obligations, anything that might satisfy adult curiosity without revealing the true source of her distress. The last thing she wanted was for word to reach Madison that she had complained to a teacher, which would undoubtedly escalate the harassment to new levels. The isolation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of Madison's campaign. Riley watched as students who had once been neutral toward her began to actively avoid her company. Group projects became exercises in rejection as potential partners found reasons to work with others. Study groups that might have welcomed her participation suddenly became exclusive affairs where her presence would clearly be unwelcome. Even students who might have been natural allies, other quiet kids who understood what it felt like to exist on the margins, seemed to sense that associating with Riley now carried risks they weren't willing to take. The social ecosystem of Riverside High had been subtly restructured to isolate her completely, turning her into a cautionary tale about what happened when you crossed the wrong people. The halls of Riverside High seemed to shift around Riley like a living organism that had decided to reject her presence. Conversations stopped when she approached, not out of respect, but from a desire to exclude her from whatever was being discussed. Teachers who had once called on her regularly began to overlook her raised hand, their eyes sliding past her as if she had become transparent. Madison's genius lay in her understanding that the most effective bullying left no obvious evidence. There were no dramatic confrontations that might attract adult intervention, no clear incidents that Riley could report to authorities. Instead, there was a steady erosion of her social standing, a gradual process of dehumanization that made her feel increasingly invisible while simultaneously making her hyper-aware of being watched and judged. The campaign reached new levels of sophistication when Madison began to recruit unwitting accomplices. She would share concerned observations about Riley's behavior with other students, painting herself as someone who was genuinely worried about a classmate who seemed to be struggling. These conversations, delivered with perfect sincerity, created the impression that Riley's isolation was a natural consequence of her own problems, rather than the result of systematic harassment. Teachers began to notice Riley's deteriorating performance and demeanor, but Madison's whisper campaign had prepared them to interpret these changes as evidence of personal issues rather than external pressure. When Riley's participation in class discussions ceased entirely, her instructors attributed it to shyness or academic struggles rather than recognizing it as a symptom of social exile. The cafeteria became a particular nightmare. Riley would enter with her lunch tray to find that every table seemed to be full, though seats would mysteriously become available after she had moved on to search elsewhere. She began eating in empty classrooms or hiding in the library, anywhere she could avoid the daily reminder of her complete social isolation. The library should have been a refuge, but even there Madison's influence reached. Riley would settle into a quiet corner with her books only to have groups of students arrive and begin loud conversations that made concentration impossible. When she moved to find peace elsewhere, the pattern would repeat, creating the impression that she was the problem, the disruptive presence that couldn't get along with others. Physical education classes became exercises in exclusion. When teens were chosen for sports, Riley would stand with the few other unwanted students, waiting to be grudgingly selected last. During partner exercises, she would find herself without a match, forcing the instructor to either pair her with an equally isolated student or assign her to work alone while everyone else collaborated. The cumulative effect was devastating. Riley began to question her own perceptions, wondering whether she was imagining the systematic nature of her treatment, or whether she really had done something to deserve such comprehensive rejection. The gaslighting was subtle but effective, making her doubt her own experiences while providing no clear path toward resolution. Her parents, when they were home long enough to notice anything, attributed her changed demeanor to typical teenage moodiness. Their demanding schedules at the hospital left little time for deep conversations about social dynamics, and Riley had become expert at providing surface-level responses that satisfied their casual inquiries without revealing the depth of her distress. Jake, her older brother, was wrapped up in his own college experiences and career preparations. Their occasional phone conversations focused on his latest engineering projects or her academic performance, safe topics that didn't require emotional vulnerability. Riley found herself unable to explain the complexity of her situation to someone who remembered high school as a series of academic and extracurricular achievements rather than a social minefield. The dojo remained her only sanctuary, though even there, she struggled to maintain the focus that had once come naturally. Sensei. Kate noticed the change in her students' performance. The way Riley's usual fluidity had been replaced by tension and distraction. During their training sessions, Riley's movements became mechanical rather than intuitive, her mind clearly elsewhere even as her body went through familiar routines. The philosophical aspects of judo that had once resonated deeply with Riley now felt abstract and irrelevant. The principle of using an opponent's force against them seemed meaningless when the attacks she faced were psychological rather than physical, when the damage being done to her was emotional rather than tangible. How could she redirect energy that came in the form of whispers and exclusion? How could she find leverage against opponents who never confronted her directly? Sensei Kate tried to address her students' obvious distress through the lens of martial arts philosophy, speaking about the importance of mental discipline and emotional balance. But her words, however well-intentioned, couldn't penetrate the fog of depression and anxiety that had settled over Riley's daily existence. The confidence and strength she had built over 3 years of training seemed to evaporate under the sustained pressure of social warfare. The worst part was the helplessness. Riley had spent years developing skills that made her feel powerful and capable, but those abilities seemed useless against the kind of systematic psychological assault she was experiencing. She couldn't throw Madison Pierce across a room for spreading rumors, couldn't use judo techniques to counter whisper campaigns or social media attacks. Sleep became increasingly elusive as Riley's mind raced through potential responses to her situation. She considered confronting Madison directly, but knew that such an approach would likely backfire spectacularly. She thought about reporting the harassment to school authorities, but couldn't point to any specific incidents that rose to the level of actionable offenses. Every possible solution seemed to carry risks that might make her situation even worse. The November rain that was so characteristic of Oregon seemed to match Riley's mood perfectly. Gray skies and persistent drizzle created an atmosphere of gloom that reflected her internal state. Walking to school each morning felt like preparing for battle. Though it was a war, she had no idea how to fight effectively. Other students who had been victims of Madison's attention in the past began to distance themselves from Riley, recognizing the signs of someone who had been marked for systematic destruction. Their own survival depended on not being associated with Madison's current target, and Riley couldn't blame them for their self-preservation instincts, even as their abandonment deepened her isolation. The campaign had been running for nearly 3 weeks when Madison decided it was time to escalate to the next phase. She had successfully isolated Riley, damaged her reputation, and undermined her confidence. But Madison was an artist of cruelty, and she understood that the most devastating attacks came when victims had been softened by prolonged psychological pressure. Riley sensed the shift before she fully understood what it meant. There was a new energy in the way Madison looked at her during their brief encounters, a predatory satisfaction that suggested something significant was being planned. Chloe and Amber seemed more animated in their whispered conversations, glancing in Riley's direction with barely concealed anticipation. The tension built over several days, creating an atmosphere of expectation that made Riley's nerves raw with anxiety. She found herself jumping at unexpected sounds, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for whatever blow was coming next. The uncertainty was almost worse than the actual harassment, leaving her in a state of perpetual fight-or-flight response that exhausted her emotionally and physically. Madison had learned patience from years of psychological warfare. She understood that the most effective attacks came when victims were least prepared to defend themselves, when their guard was down and their resistance had been worn away by sustained pressure. The isolation campaign had served its purpose perfectly, leaving Riley friendless, anxious, and completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. The setup was masterful in its simplicity. Madison had identified the perfect moment, the ideal location, and the most devastating approach. She had studied Riley's routines, noted her vulnerabilities, and planned an attack that would be impossible to defend against or explain away. It would be public enough to ensure maximum humiliation while being swift enough to minimize the risk of adult intervention. Riley walked through the halls of Riverside High, completely unaware that she was moving toward a moment that would change everything. The careful balance she had maintained for 3 years was about to be shattered in the most humiliating way possible, but in that destruction would also lie the seeds of something Madison Pierce had never anticipated. Because sometimes the quietest people are quiet for a reason, and sometimes the most devastating responses come from the most unexpected places. Madison was about to discover that there are some lines that should never be crossed, some boundaries that even the most privileged bullies ignore at their own peril. Part 3. The Breaking Point. The November morning carried an unusual stillness through the corridors of Riverside High, the kind of quiet that precedes significant storms. Riley navigated the familiar hallways with her typical caution, unaware that today would mark the end of her 3-year anonymity in the most brutal way imaginable. Third period American history had always been Riley's favorite class, not because of the subject matter, but because of its location in the East Wing's quieter section. The classroom sat adjacent to a large window that overlooked the school's courtyard, providing natural light that made the space feel less institutional than most academic environments. Mr. Davidson, a mild-mannered teacher nearing retirement, maintained a classroom atmosphere that felt safe and predictable. Riley had claimed the same seat since the beginning of the semester, 2 rows from the back near the window, positioned to avoid drawing attention while still being able to see the board clearly. She had developed a routine of arriving early, to settle in before the room filled with other students, using those few minutes of quiet to organize her thoughts and prepare for whatever the day might bring. On this particular morning, the routine felt especially important. The sustained psychological pressure from Madison's campaign had left Riley feeling constantly off balance, never quite sure when the next attack might come or what form it might take. The familiar rhythm of arranging her notebooks and pens provided a small sense of control in a world that increasingly felt chaotic and unpredictable. Other students filtered into the classroom with the usual mix of sleepy complaints and animated conversations about weekend plans. Riley kept her eyes focused on her desk, having learned that eye contact with certain classmates could be interpreted as an invitation for unwanted attention. She had perfected the art of appearing busy, even when she had nothing particular to do, a defensive strategy that usually allowed her to blend into the background. Madison Pierce entered the classroom with her characteristic confidence, surrounded by her usual entourage of carefully chosen followers. She moved through the space like someone who owned it, claiming seats in the prime location near the center of the room where she could see and be seen by everyone. Her presence immediately shifted the energy of the classroom, drawing attention and conversation toward her as if she were a magnet for social interaction. Chloe Reynolds settled beside Madison with practiced ease, already pulling out her phone to document whatever might be worth sharing with their online followers. Amber Walsh took the seat directly behind Madison, positioning herself to serve as both audience and backup for whatever performance might unfold. Their choreographed arrangement spoke to years of collaboration in social manipulation. Riley felt the familiar tension that came with sharing space with her tormentors, but nothing in Madison's behavior suggested that today would be different from any other. If anything, Madison seemed more relaxed than usual, laughing easily at Chloe's whispered comments and participating normally in the pre-class social interactions that Riley observed from her peripheral position. Mr. Davidson called for attention and began his lecture on the Industrial Revolution, a topic that seemed particularly relevant given the mechanical precision with which Madison had been dismantling Riley's social standing. Riley tried to focus on the content, taking detailed notes in an attempt to maintain some semblance of academic normalcy, despite the psychological chaos that had become her daily reality. The attack, when it came, was swift and devastating in its efficiency. Riley had been leaning forward to copy a diagram from the board when she felt a sudden, sharp pressure against her back. The sensation was followed immediately by a soft snapping sound that she didn't immediately understand, though. The feeling of looseness around her torso told her that something significant had just happened. Madison's voice cut through the classroom's quiet concentration with mock concern and barely concealed amusement. She spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear while maintaining a tone that suggested she was trying to be helpful rather than cruel. Her words carried the perfect blend of false sympathy and genuine malice that had made her such an effective social predator. The realization of what had occurred hit Riley like a physical blow to her stomach. The careful cut through her bra strap had been executed with surgical precision, using small scissors that Madison had concealed in her hand during what appeared to be a casual stretching motion. The garment now hung loose and useless beneath Riley's shirt, creating an obvious and humiliating change in her silhouette that would be immediately apparent to anyone who looked in her direction. The classroom erupted in the kind of delighted chaos that teenagers create when witnessing someone else's misfortune. Laughter bubbled up from multiple directions as students turned to stare at Riley, whose face had gone crimson with embarrassment and shock. The sound seemed to echo off the walls, creating an amplified sense of public humiliation that made the moment feel even more devastating than it already was. Chloe's phone was recording within seconds, capturing Riley's mortified expression and the obvious evidence of what had just occurred. The footage would be edited and shared across multiple social media platforms within minutes, ensuring that Riley's humiliation would extend far beyond the physical boundaries of the classroom. The digital documentation transformed a moment of personal embarrassment into a permanent record of social destruction. Mr. Davidson's response was everything that was wrong with adult authority in the face of teenage cruelty. Rather than addressing the obvious assault that had just occurred, he focused on restoring order to his classroom with minimal disruption to his lesson plan. His discomfort with the situation was obvious, but his priority seemed to be avoiding rather than confronting the problem that had just unfolded in front of him. His half-hearted reprimand of Madison carried no real authority or consequence, delivered with the tone of someone who wanted the situation to resolve itself without requiring any actual intervention on his part. The detention he assigned was perfunctory at best, a minor inconvenience that everyone understood would do nothing to address the real damage that had been done. The ruined undergarment that he awkwardly retrieved and handed to Riley served as physical evidence of the attack, but his obvious embarrassment about dealing with anything related to female anatomy made it clear that he viewed the incident as an uncomfortable distraction rather than a serious violation. His suggestion that Riley visit the nurse's office was delivered with the clear hope that someone else would take responsibility for managing the situation. The bell that ended the class period released the students into the hallways, where the story of Riley's humiliation began to spread with the viral efficiency that characterizes teenage social networks. By the time she reached her locker, whispered conversations were already taking place in every corner of the school, each retelling adding new details and interpretations to the basic facts of what had occurred. Riley's flight to the bathroom, was witnessed by dozens of students, all of whom understood that they were seeing someone in the process of complete social collapse. The image of her clutching the ruined bra while trying to hold her shirt in place would become part of the story's mythology, a visual representation of vulnerability that would be referenced and mocked for weeks to come. The locked bathroom stall became Riley's temporary refuge, a small space where she could attempt to process what had just happened without the pressure of public observation. But even there, the walls seemed to echo with the laughter that had erupted in the classroom, the sound playing on repeat in her mind as she struggled to understand how her life had changed so dramatically in the span of a few seconds. The physical violation was devastating enough, but the public nature of the attack made it exponentially worse. Madison had chosen her moment perfectly, ensuring maximum audience for Riley's humiliation while minimizing her own risk of serious consequences. The precision of the execution spoke to careful planning and a deep understanding of how to inflict maximum psychological damage. Riley's hands shook as she examined the severed strap, the clean cut providing clear evidence that this had been no accident. The deliberate nature of the attack made it feel like a personal assault rather than a teenage prank, a crossing of boundaries that went beyond typical bullying into something that felt genuinely criminal. The tears came in waves, each one carrying a different aspect of her humiliation and rage. She cried for the loss of her carefully maintained privacy, for the violation of her physical boundaries, for the laughter of classmates who found entertainment in her suffering. But beneath the immediate emotional response, something else was beginning to stir. The conversation with her sister Ellie that she remembered from years past suddenly felt relevant in a way it never had before. The advice about fighting back, about not letting anyone make you feel small, had seemed abstract when Riley was younger. But now, sitting in a bathroom stall with a severed bra in her hands, and the echo of cruel laughter in her ears, those words carried new weight and meaning. Riley's mind began to move beyond the immediate trauma towards something more calculating and purposeful. The skills she had been developing at the dojo, the strength and confidence she had built through years of training, suddenly felt less like abstract accomplishments and more like practical tools that might be applied to her current situation. The philosophical teachings of Sensei Kate about using an opponent's force against them took on new relevance as Riley considered her options. Madison's attack had been devastating, but it had also revealed something important about her character and methods. The precision and public nature of the assault showed a level of cruelty that went beyond typical teenage meanness into something that most people would find genuinely disturbing. For the first time since the campaign against her had begun, Riley felt something other than helplessness and despair. The emotion building in her chest was unfamiliar but powerful, a combination of righteous anger and cold determination that seemed to crystallize everything she had learned about herself over the past 3 years. Madison Pierce had made a critical error in judgment. She had assumed that Riley would respond to this ultimate humiliation the same way she had responded to everything else, with passive acceptance and internalized shame. But Madison had never encountered someone who possessed the kind of skills and inner strength that Riley had been quietly developing. The tears gradually stopped as Riley's breathing steadied and her mind cleared. She was still sitting in a bathroom stall with a destroyed undergarment in her hands, still facing the prospect of walking through hallways filled with students who had witnessed her humiliation. But something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of the situation and her options for responding to it. The question was no longer whether she would fight back, but how and when she would choose to reveal the person she had become through 3 years of martial arts training. Madison had crossed a line that demanded a response, and Riley was beginning to understand that she possessed exactly the skills necessary to provide one. The bathroom door opened and closed several times as other students came and went, but Riley remained in her stall, using the time to think through her options and plan her next moves. She could feel the familiar calm that preceded action settling over her, the same focused state of mind that came before executing a difficult judo technique. When she finally emerged from the bathroom, Riley Thompson was no longer the same person who had entered it. The quiet girl who had spent 3 years avoiding confrontation was still there, but she was no longer the only aspect of Riley's personality. Something harder and more dangerous had awakened, something that Madison Pierce was about to discover she should never have provoked. Part 4. The Awakening. The afternoon light filtering through the windows of Riverside Community Dojo carried an unusual intensity as Riley pushed through the familiar doors, her gym bag clutched tightly against her chest. The events of the morning felt like they had occurred in a different lifetime, though the physical evidence of Madison's attack remained tucked away in her backpack, a constant reminder of the humiliation she had endured just hours earlier. "Sensei." Kate looked up from organizing equipment as Riley entered, immediately noting the tension in her student's posture and the barely controlled emotion flickering behind her eyes. After 3 years of working together, the older woman had developed an almost intuitive understanding of Riley's moods and states of mind. But something about today felt different, more charged with potential energy than the quiet determination that usually characterized their training sessions. Riley changed into her GI with mechanical precision, the familiar ritual of preparing for practice, providing a temporary anchor in what felt like an increasingly chaotic world. The white uniform felt different against her skin today, less like training clothes and more like armor, a physical manifestation of the strength and skill she had been developing in this sacred space. The dojo was empty except for the two of them, which suited Riley's current need for privacy and reflection. She bowed respectfully to Sensei Kate before taking her position on the mat, but her instructor could see that her student's mind was elsewhere, processing something significant that had occurred outside these walls. The warm-up exercises began, as they always did, with basic movements designed to center the mind and prepare the body for more demanding techniques. But Riley's execution of even these fundamental motions carried an edge of barely controlled aggression that hadn't been present in previous sessions. Her punches cut through the air with unusual force, her kicks carried extra snap, and her footwork possessed a sharpness that spoke to heightened emotional intensity. Sensei Kate allowed the session to proceed normally for the first few minutes, watching carefully as Riley worked through basic combinations with fierce concentration. The philosophical discussions that usually accompanied their physical training were absent today, replaced by an almost meditative silence that felt heavy with unspoken meaning. When they moved to partner exercises, the difference in Riley's approach became even more pronounced. The techniques that she had always executed with careful control now carried an underlying violence that made them feel more like actual combat than practice. Her throws were harder, her holds tighter, and her reactions faster than they had ever been before. It was during a series of defensive maneuvers that the story finally began to emerge. Sensei Kate had been demonstrating responses to various types of attacks when Riley's reaction to a simulated grab from behind became explosive rather than measured. The counter technique she executed was flawless, but delivered with a level of force that would have seriously injured an actual attacker. The older woman called for a pause in the training, recognizing that her student was working through something significant that needed to be addressed before they could continue safely. Riley's breathing was elevated not from physical exertion, but from emotional intensity, and Sensei Kate understood that this was a moment that required careful handling. The conversation that followed began slowly, with Riley reluctant to share the details of what had occurred at school. Years of training had taught her to internalize challenges and work through problems independently, but the magnitude of Madison's attack had shaken her in ways that made isolation feel impossible to maintain. Sensei Kate's patient questioning gradually drew out the story, each detail adding to her understanding of why her student had arrived at the dojo in such an agitated state. The systematic harassment, the public humiliation, the violation of physical boundaries, all of it painted a picture of psychological warfare that went far beyond typical teenage social conflicts. As Riley described Madison's campaign against her, Sensei Kate began to understand the full scope of what her student had been enduring. The martial arts instructor had seen bullying before, had worked with students who came to the dojo seeking strength and confidence in the face of social pressures. But the calculated cruelty that Riley described represented something more sophisticated and dangerous than typical schoolyard harassment. The conversation gradually shifted from recounting events to discussing options and responses. Sensei Kate's approach was measured and thoughtful, drawing on both her martial arts philosophy and her understanding of teenage social dynamics to help Riley think through the complexities of her situation. The principle of proportional response became central to their discussion. Judo taught that the most effective techniques used an opponent's force against them rather than meeting aggression with greater aggression. Applied to Riley's current situation, this suggested finding ways to turn Madison's own methods and motivations into the source of her downfall. But Sensei Kate also recognized that her student was at a critical juncture in her development, both as a martial artist and as a person. The skills Riley had developed over 3 years of training had given her capabilities that most of her peers could never imagine. But with those capabilities came responsibilities that needed to be carefully considered. The discussion of self-defense took on new dimensions as they explored the difference between physical and psychological attacks. Riley's martial arts training had prepared her to respond to direct physical threats, but Madison's methods were more subtle and complex, requiring responses that went beyond simple defensive techniques. Sensei Kate shared stories from her own competitive career, describing situations where opponents had attempted to use psychological warfare to gain advantages. The most successful responses, she explained, came not from emotional reactions but from calm, strategic thinking that turned psychological attacks into opportunities for demonstration of superior skill and character. The concept of mental discipline became particularly relevant as they discussed Riley's options. The anger and humiliation she felt were natural responses to the treatment she had received, but allowing those emotions to drive her actions would likely lead to outcomes that she would later regret. True martial arts mastery required channeling those feelings into focused, purposeful action. Riley found herself reconsidering the events of the past few weeks through the lens of judo philosophy. Madison's attacks had been successful primarily because Riley had responded exactly as expected, absorbing the aggression without redirecting it back toward its source. But what if she could find ways to use Madison's own methods and motivations against her? The training session that followed their conversation was different from any they had shared before. Riley's movements carried new purpose and precision, as if the discussion had helped her understand how to channel her emotional intensity into technical improvement. Her throws were still forceful, but now they were controlled and purposeful rather than explosive and reactive. Sensei Kate introduced advanced techniques that they had been building toward for months, recognizing that Riley's current state of mind made her ready to handle more sophisticated applications of judo principles. The combination of technical skill and philosophical understanding that characterized true martial arts mastery was beginning to emerge in her students' performance. The session concluded with meditation, a practice that Riley had sometimes found difficult, but which now felt essential to her preparation for whatever was to come. Sitting in quiet reflection, she could feel the anger and humiliation from the morning's events transforming into something more useful and directed. As they prepared to leave the dojo, Sensei Kate offered final thoughts about the importance of choosing responses that would enhance rather than diminish Riley's character. The skills she had developed carried with them an obligation to use them wisely in ways that would bring honor to the art and to herself. Riley left the dojo that evening feeling fundamentally different from the person who had entered it hours earlier. The humiliated girl who had hidden in a bathroom stall was still part of her, but she was no longer the dominant aspect of her personality. Something stronger and more capable had emerged, something that Madison Pierce had inadvertently awakened. Through her cruel attack, the drive home provided time for reflection and planning. Riley's mind was clearer than it had been in weeks, the fog of depression and anxiety replaced by focused determination. She understood now that Madison's campaign against her had been successful only because she had never truly fought back, had never revealed the capabilities she possessed. But she also understood that any response would need to be carefully planned and executed. The skills she had developed at the dojo were powerful, but they needed to be applied with wisdom and restraint. The goal was not revenge but justice. Not destruction but education about the consequences of crossing certain boundaries. The conversation with her brother Jake that evening took on new significance as Riley considered her options. His casual mention of a school event that weekend provided the seed of an idea that began to grow as she thought through the logistics and potential outcomes. Madison Pierce had chosen to make Riley's humiliation public, turning it into entertainment for the student body of Riverside High. But public forums worked both ways, and Riley was beginning to understand that the same stage that had been used for her destruction might also serve as the venue for Madison's education about the true nature of strength and consequence. The planning that began that night was methodical and thorough, drawing on everything Riley had learned about strategy, timing, and the effective application of force. Madison had made the mistake of assuming that her victim would remain passive, that the quiet girl she had targeted would continue to absorb punishment without ever fighting back. But Madison had never encountered someone who possessed Riley's combination of technical skill, philosophical grounding, and righteous anger. The campaign of psychological warfare that had seemed so successful was about to encounter a response that would change the social dynamics of Riverside High forever. Riley spent the evening preparing not just mentally but physically, reviewing techniques and considering applications that would be both effective and appropriate to the situation she was planning to create. The skills that had once seemed abstract and theoretical were about to be tested in the most real and consequential way possible. The transformation was complete. The quiet girl who had spent 3 years avoiding confrontation was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you choose to fight. Madison Pierce was about to discover that there are consequences to psychological warfare, and that some opponents are far more dangerous than they appear. Part 5. The Preparation. The weekend that followed Madison's attack passed with deceptive calm at the Thompson household. Though beneath the surface, Riley's mind worked with the precision of a chess master planning, moved several steps in advance. Her parents, caught up in their demanding hospital schedules, noticed only that their daughter seemed more focused than usual, attributing her quiet intensity to college application stress rather than recognizing the signs of someone preparing for psychological warfare. Saturday morning found Riley in her bedroom with her laptop open, researching everything she could find about Riverside High's upcoming Winter Spirit Week. The annual celebration culminated in a pep rally that drew the entire student body to the gymnasium, creating exactly the kind of public forum that Madison had used so effectively against her. The irony was not lost on Riley that she was planning to use Madison's own preferred weapon, public attention, as the foundation for her response. The pep rally would feature the usual mix of cheerleading routines, athletic team recognitions, and student performances designed to build school spirit before winter break. But this year's event carried additional significance because it would include demonstrations from various school clubs and organizations, including what had been advertised as a martial arts exhibition by members of the community dojo program. Riley's participation in the martial arts demonstration had been arranged weeks earlier, back when such public visibility had seemed like her worst nightmare rather than a strategic opportunity. Sensei Kate had encouraged several of her students to showcase their skills as a way of promoting the dojo and demonstrating the practical benefits of martial arts training to their peers. The original plan had been for Riley to participate, a basic demonstration of throws and defensive techniques, working with other students to show the beauty and effectiveness of judo principles. But as she sat in her bedroom reviewing the demonstration requirements, Riley began to see possibilities that her instructor had never intended, and that Madison Pierce would never anticipate. The rules for the demonstration were surprisingly flexible, allowing participants to showcase techniques that best represented their training and abilities. The only requirements were that demonstrations be safe, educational, and appropriate for a high school audience. Riley found herself wondering just how broadly those guidelines might be interpreted by someone with the right motivation and sufficient skill. Sunday afternoon found her back at the dojo, ostensibly for regular practice, but actually to test some of the ideas that had been developing in her mind. Sensei Kate was pleased to see her students' renewed focus and intensity, interpreting Riley's increased dedication as a positive response to whatever challenges she had been facing at school. The training session began with standard warm-up exercises, but Riley's attention was focused on techniques that would be particularly effective for public demonstration. She worked through various throws and defensive maneuvers with unusual care, paying attention not just to their technical execution, but to their visual impact and dramatic potential. Sensei Kate introduced several advanced techniques that had been part of Riley's recent curriculum, including combination moves that flowed seamlessly from defensive positions into decisive offensive actions. These were the kinds of sophisticated applications that separated true martial artists from casual practitioners, requiring both technical precision and tactical understanding. Riley absorbed every detail with focused intensity, understanding that she was preparing for more than just a school demonstration. The technique she was learning and refining would need to serve multiple purposes simultaneously, showcasing genuine martial arts skill, providing educational value for the audience, and delivering a message that certain individuals would understand with perfect clarity. The gymnasium erupted in chaos as 17-year-old Riley Thompson executed a perfect shoulder throw, sending Madison Pierce crashing to the mat with a sickening thud that echoed through the packed bleachers. What started as cruel humiliation in a hallway at Riverside High had transformed into something none of these bullies saw coming. A quiet girl who had been hiding black belt judo skills for 3 years was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The same hands that had been violated and humiliated just hours earlier were now weapons of precision, and Madison's screams for help would be heard by the entire school. Riley walked through the East Wing hallway with unusual deliberation that Monday morning, her steps measured and purposeful in a way that would have seemed unremarkable to casual observers, but carried deeper significance for someone who knew what to look for. The weekend had provided time for reflection and planning, and she moved through the familiar corridors with the focused calm of someone who had made important decisions about her future. The morning classes passed without incident, creating a false sense of normalcy that would make the afternoon's events even more shocking by contrast. Riley participated in discussions when called upon, completed assignments with her typical thoroughness, and maintained the careful invisibility that had protected her for most of her high school career. But beneath the surface performance, something fundamental had changed. Madison Pierce arrived at school that morning in particularly high spirits, energized by the social media response to Friday's bathroom incident and the weekend gossip that had solidified Riley's status as a social pariah. The video footage that Chloe had captured and carefully edited had been shared across multiple platforms, generating the kind of viral engagement that fed Madison's need for attention and validation. The comments and reactions had been everything Madison could have hoped for, a mixture of shocked laughter, cruel observations, and expressions of sympathy that positioned her as someone who had been forced to deal with an awkward situation not of her own making. The narrative had been crafted perfectly, presenting Riley as a clumsy, socially awkward individual whose own actions had led to her embarrassment. Chloe Reynolds basked in the reflected glory of her documentation and distribution of the incident, her follower count swelling as people shared and commented on her content. She had become something of a celebrity among her peers for her skill at capturing and presenting moments of social drama, and Friday's events represented the pinnacle of her amateur journalism career. Amber Walsh took satisfaction in the more direct results of their campaign against Riley. The target of their attention had become visibly withdrawn and anxious, displaying all the signs of someone whose psychological defenses had been systematically dismantled. From Amber's perspective, they had achieved exactly what they set out to accomplish, establishing clear consequences for anyone who might consider crossing them in the future. The trio moved through the school that Monday with the confidence of generals who had won a decisive victory, their conversation peppered with references to their conquest and speculation about how long it might take for Riley to transfer schools or otherwise remove herself from their sphere of influence. They had seen this pattern before with previous targets, and they expected Riley to follow the same trajectory toward complete social exile. But Riley Thompson was not following the expected script. Instead of avoiding the hallways where she might encounter her tormentors, she seemed to be moving through the school with increased visibility. Instead of eating lunch in isolation, she could be seen in the cafeteria, albeit sitting alone, but no longer hiding in corners or empty classrooms. The change was subtle enough that most students didn't notice it consciously, but Madison's predatory instincts detected something different in her victim's behavior. Riley's posture seemed straighter, her movements more deliberate, and her eyes no longer cast downward in the submissive manner that had characterized her behavior since the harassment campaign began. The realization that Riley might not be responding as expected created a new source of irritation for Madison, who had expected complete capitulation by this point in the process. Previous targets had been effectively neutralized within days of such a comprehensive attack, but Riley seemed to be exhibiting unexpected resilience that demanded further attention. The decision to escalate came during fourth period, when Madison observed Riley participating normally in class discussion. Despite everything that had occurred, the sight of her target behaving as if nothing had happened struck Madison as a form of defiance that could not be tolerated, a challenge to her authority that demanded immediate and decisive response. The planning session that took place during lunch was brief but thorough, with Madison outlining a strategy that would remove any doubt about who controlled the social dynamics at Riverside High. The bathroom incident had been effective but relatively private. What was needed now was something more public and more devastating, something that would eliminate any possibility of Riley recovering her social standing. Chloe suggested leveraging the upcoming pep rally as an opportunity for maximum exposure, noting that the entire student body would be gathered in one location with their attention focused on the performers and presentations. Any incident that occurred during such an event would be witnessed by hundreds of people and would likely be recorded by multiple devices for later distribution. Amber proposed a more direct approach that would build on the success of Friday's attack, suggesting physical humiliation that would be impossible for Riley to ignore or rationalize away. The combination of public setting and personal violation would create the kind of traumatic experience that would end Riley's resistance once and for all. Madison synthesized these suggestions into a plan that incorporated the best elements of both approaches, creating a scenario that would maximize both immediate impact and long-term consequences. The pep rally would provide the perfect stage for a performance that would establish her dominance so clearly that no future challenges would be possible. The anticipation built throughout the afternoon as word spread through Madison's network about something significant being planned for the pep rally. The details were kept deliberately vague to maintain operational security, but the promise of entertainment at Riley's expense generated excitement among students who had been following the ongoing drama. Riley sensed the shift in energy around her as the day progressed, noting the increased attention she was receiving from students who had previously ignored her existence. Conversation seemed to stop when she approached, replaced by meaningful glances and barely suppressed smiles that suggested something was being planned for her benefit. The final period before the pep rally passed with unusual tension, as if the entire school was holding its breath in anticipation of some dramatic event. Teachers seemed distracted, students appeared restless, and there was an undercurrent of excitement that felt different from typical pre-event enthusiasm. Riley used the time to center herself mentally, drawing on the meditation techniques she had learned at the dojo to maintain focus and clarity, despite the obvious signs that she was walking into some kind of trap. The principles of judo that Sensei Kate had taught her about remaining calm under pressure felt particularly relevant as she prepared for whatever Madison had planned. The gymnasium began filling with students 30 minutes before the official start time, creating a buzz of conversation and anticipation that felt more charged than usual. The bleachers filled quickly as word spread that something special was expected to happen, though most attendees had only vague ideas about what they might witness. Madison and her crew positioned themselves strategically in the middle sections of the bleachers, where they would have optimal viewing angles for both the official program and any unofficial entertainment that might unfold. Their placement also ensured that they would be visible to anyone looking up from the gymnasium floor, allowing them to serve as both directors and audience for whatever drama was about to unfold. Riley entered the gymnasium with the other students, moving toward the section where her homeroom class typically sat during school assemblies. But as she climbed the bleacher steps, she noticed Madison gesturing toward a different area, indicating that she wanted Riley to sit in a specific location that would better serve whatever plans had been made. The realization that she was being positioned like a piece on a chessboard crystallized Riley's understanding of how thoroughly this moment had been orchestrated. Madison wasn't simply planning another random attack. She had created an elaborate production designed to maximize both spectacle and humiliation. With Riley cast as the unwilling star of a performance she had no role in writing. The pep rally began with the usual mix of cheerleading routines and administrative announcements, but the energy in the gymnasium felt different from previous events. There was an undercurrent of anticipation that had nothing to do with school spirit and everything to do with the expectation that something dramatic was about to unfold. Principal Martinez took the microphone to introduce the various presentations that would make up the program, including recognition of fall sports achievements, performances by the drama and music departments, and demonstrations by several school clubs and community organizations. His voice carried the forced enthusiasm that characterized most administrative attempts at generating student excitement. The martial arts demonstration was scheduled for the middle of the program, positioned between the marching band performance and the senior class comedy skits. Sensei Kate had arrived with 3 of her students who would be participating in the presentation, all of them dressed in their formal GIs and carrying themselves with the disciplined bearing that characterized serious martial artists. Riley watched from her assigned position in the bleachers as the demonstration area was prepared, noting the positioning of the mats and the sight lines that would give the audience optimal viewing angles. The setup was professional and thorough, reflecting Sensei Kate's experience with public presentations and her commitment to representing the art properly. But Riley also noticed other preparations that had nothing to do with the official program. Madison and her followers were positioning themselves with unusual care, and several students in the surrounding area had their phones ready to record whatever might unfold. The convergence of official programming and unofficial plotting created a sense of impending collision that made the atmosphere feel electric with possibility. The moment of truth was approaching, and Riley understood with perfect clarity that she was about to face the most significant challenge of her young life. Madison Pierce had orchestrated this moment with the precision of a military campaign, but she had made one critical error in her planning. She had assumed that her target would remain passive, that the quiet girl she had been tormenting would continue to absorb punishment without fighting back. Madison was about to discover that there are some people who become more dangerous when they are cornered, some opponents who reveal their true strength only when pushed beyond their breaking point. The pep rally that was supposed to showcase school spirit was about to become the stage for a very different kind of demonstration, one that would change the social dynamics of Riverside High forever. The gymnasium fell silent as the martial arts demonstration was announced, but the quiet carried an undertone of anticipation that had nothing to do with appreciation for athletic skill. Riley could feel hundreds of eyes focused on her, waiting to see how the final act of her public humiliation would unfold. But as she rose from her seat in the bleachers, Riley Thompson was no longer the same person who had been hiding in bathroom stalls just days earlier. The weekend had transformed her understanding of herself and her capabilities, and she moved toward the gymnasium floor with the purposeful stride of someone who had made peace with what was about to happen. Madison Pierce had spent weeks planning this moment, but she had never considered the possibility that her victim might have plans of her own. The quiet girl who had absorbed 3 weeks of systematic psychological warfare was about to reveal skills that would turn Madison's carefully orchestrated humiliation into something entirely different. The stage was set, the audience was in place, and the performance was about to begin. But this time, Riley Thompson would be writing her own script. Part 4. The revelation. The martial arts demonstration area stretched across the polished gymnasium floor like a stage prepared for the most important performance of Riley's life. The regulation judo mats formed a perfect rectangle in the center of the space, surrounded by portable barriers that created clear sight lines for the hundreds of students filling the bleachers. Sensei Kate stood at the edge of the demonstration area with quiet dignity, her presence commanding respect from an audience that rarely showed genuine appreciation for adult authority. Riley descended from the bleachers with measured steps, her movement drawing curious glances from classmates who had never seen her participate in any kind of public performance. The whispers that followed her progress toward the gymnasium floor carried a mixture of anticipation and confusion, as students struggled to reconcile the quiet girl they knew with someone confident enough to participate in a martial arts demonstration. Madison Pierce watched from her strategic position in the middle section of bleachers, her satisfaction evident as she observed Riley walking directly into what she assumed would be the final act of her systematic destruction. The positioning was perfect, the audience was primed, and the target was moving exactly where Madison wanted her to be. Every detail had been orchestrated to ensure maximum impact when the moment of attack arrived. Chloe Reynolds had her phone positioned for optimal recording angles, having scouted the best vantage points during the previous week's preparation. Her followers were already commenting on her social media posts about something special happening at the pep rally, building anticipation for content that would likely generate thousands of views and shares across multiple platforms. Amber Walsh sat with barely contained excitement, her role in the upcoming performance clearly defined and eagerly anticipated. The physical aspects of what they had planned would fall primarily to her, and she relished the opportunity to demonstrate her loyalty to Madison while contributing to Riley's complete social annihilation. But as Riley approached the demonstration area, something in her demeanor began to register with the more observant members of the audience. Her posture carried a confidence that seemed inconsistent with someone who had been the target of sustained harassment, and her movements suggested familiarity with the environment. She was entering rather than the nervous uncertainty of a reluctant participant. Sensei Kate greeted Riley with a respectful bow that was returned with equal formality, The exchange, drawing murmurs from students who had never seen their classmate demonstrate such disciplined behavior. The instructor's introduction of her students was brief but thorough, explaining their training backgrounds and the techniques they would be demonstrating for the audience. Riley's introduction drew the most significant response from the crowd, not because of her achievements, which Sensei Kate listed matter-of-factly, but because of the disconnect between her reputation as a quiet, unremarkable student and her apparent status as an accomplished martial artist. The audience learned that their classmate held a second-degree black belt, had been training for over 3 years, and specialized in techniques that emphasized using an opponent's strength against them. The demonstration began with basic movements designed to educate the audience about fundamental judo principles. Riley and her training partners executed throws and defensive maneuvers with fluid precision, their movements carrying the kind of natural rhythm that comes only from years of dedicated practice. The audience, initially restless and inattentive, gradually became absorbed in the unexpected grace and power of what they were witnessing. Madison felt a growing sense of unease as she watched Riley perform techniques that demonstrated a level of physical capability she had never suspected. The quiet girl who had absorbed weeks of psychological torture without fighting back was revealing skills that suggested she had always possessed the ability to respond with devastating effectiveness. The realization that she had been systematically tormenting someone who could have ended her harassment at any time created a cold pit of anxiety in Madison's stomach. But she pushed aside her growing doubts, reminding herself that physical skills were irrelevant in the context of social warfare. Riley's martial arts abilities might be impressive, but they couldn't undo the damage that had already been done to her reputation and social standing. The demonstration progressed through increasingly advanced techniques, with Riley serving as both instructor and participant in scenarios that showcased the practical applications of judo principles. Her explanations to the audience were clear and confident, revealing communication skills that her classmates had never had the opportunity to observe. But Madison noticed that Riley's eyes occasionally swept across the bleachers, and when their gazes met, something in Riley's expression suggested that this performance was not entirely what it appeared to be. There was a purposefulness in her movements and positioning that seemed to extend beyond the requirements of the demonstration, as if she were preparing for something that went beyond showcasing martial arts techniques. The climax of the official demonstration featured advanced throw-in techniques that required precise timing and perfect execution. Riley served as the primary demonstrator, executing complex maneuvers that drew gasps of appreciation from an audience that had never expected to witness such skill from one of their classmates. As the formal presentation neared its conclusion, Sensei Kate invited questions from the audience, opening a dialogue that was supposed to allow students to learn more about martial arts training and philosophy. The questions began predictably, focusing on basic aspects of technique and training requirements, but the interaction created an opportunity for something that Madison had not anticipated. Riley's responses to audience questions revealed depth of knowledge and philosophical understanding that impressed even the adults in attendance. She spoke about discipline, respect, and the responsibility that came with possessing skills that could cause harm, her words carrying weight that commanded attention from students who had previously dismissed her as insignificant. But as the question and answer session continued, Madison decided that she had waited long enough for the perfect moment to execute her plan. The audience was focused, the target was isolated in the center of the gymnasium, and any attack would be witnessed by hundreds of people who would spread the story throughout the school and beyond. Madison rose from her seat with theatrical precision, drawing attention from the surrounding students as she prepared to descend toward the gymnasium floor. Her movement was calculated to suggest spontaneity while actually representing the culmination of careful planning and preparation. Chloe immediately began recording, her phone positioned to capture both Madison's performance and Riley's anticipated reaction. The students around them sensed that something significant was about to happen, and conversations died as attention focused on Madison's purposeful movement toward the demonstration area. Amber followed Madison's lead, rising from her own seat and beginning her descent toward the gymnasium floor. The coordinated movement of Madison's inner circle was noticed by students throughout the bleachers, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that had nothing to do with martial arts education. Principal Martinez observed the movement from his position near the gymnasium entrance, but assumed that the students were simply expressing enthusiasm for the demonstration. His experience with school assemblies had taught him to expect some degree of audience participation, and he saw no reason to intervene in what appeared to be student engagement with the educational program. Riley noticed Madison's approach immediately. Her peripheral vision, trained by years of martial arts practice, to detect movement and potential threats. But instead of the anxiety that Madison expected to see, Riley's expression carried calm focus that suggested she had been anticipating exactly this moment. The convergence of official programming and unofficial plotting was about to create a collision that would redefine the social dynamics of Riverside High School. Madison Pierce was walking directly into a demonstration of principles she had never learned, against an opponent whose capability she had completely underestimated. The gymnasium buzzed with anticipation as Madison reached the edge of the demonstration area, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from educational to confrontational. She had planned this moment with meticulous care, but she had never considered the possibility that Riley Thompson might have plans of her own. The martial arts demonstration was about to become something entirely different, a practical application of techniques and principles that would provide the audience with an education they would never forget. Madison had created the perfect stage for her own destruction, and Riley was prepared to give everyone exactly the kind of demonstration they deserved. Part 5. The Trap Springs Madison. Pierce stepped onto the demonstration mat with the confident stride of someone who had never encountered real opposition, her designer sneakers squeaking against the polished surface as she invaded the space that had been carefully prepared for educational purposes. The gymnasium fell into an expectant hush, hundreds of students sensing that the official program was about to be interrupted by something far more dramatic and personally relevant than martial arts instruction. Riley remained in the center of the mat, her posture relaxed but alert in the way that experienced martial artists maintained readiness without appearing aggressive. Her breathing was steady and controlled, drawing on years of training that had taught her to remain calm under pressure and to use anticipation as a tactical advantage rather than a source of anxiety. Madison's opening words were delivered with theatrical precision, her voice carrying across the gymnasium with the kind of projected confidence that had served her well in countless previous performances of social dominance. She spoke about authenticity and pretense, about people who tried to present themselves as something they weren't, her meaning clear to everyone who had been following the ongoing drama between them. The audience recognized immediately that they were witnessing the continuation of a conflict that had been building for weeks, and the energy in the gymnasium shifted from polite attention to fierce anticipation. Students leaned forward in their seats, phones appeared throughout the bleachers, and conversations died as everyone focused on the confrontation unfolding before them. Chloe Reynolds positioned herself for optimal recording angles, her experience with documenting social drama serving her well as she captured both participants from multiple perspectives. Her social media followers were already commenting in real time as she live-streamed the event, generating engagement that exceeded anything she had previously achieved. Amber Walsh moved to flank Riley from a different angle, her positioning designed to create the kind of overwhelming psychological pressure that had proven effective in previous campaigns. The three-girl formation that had intimidated countless targets was being deployed with practiced efficiency, each member playing her assigned role in what they assumed would be Riley's final humiliation. But Riley's response to their coordinated approach was not what any of them had expected. Instead of the defensive posture and obvious anxiety that had characterized her previous encounters with Madison's group, she remained centered and calm, her eyes tracking all three opponents with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested extensive training in managing multiple threats. Sensei Kate observed the developing situation with growing concern, recognizing that her student was facing a form of harassment that went beyond typical teenage social conflicts. But she also noticed that Riley's demeanor carried none of the distress that such attacks usually generated, suggesting that something fundamental had changed in her student's approach to confrontation. Madison escalated her verbal assault with calculated precision, incorporating references to the bathroom incident and other moments of humiliation that she assumed would trigger emotional responses and defensive behavior. Her words were chosen for maximum psychological impact, designed to reduce Riley to tears or anger that would validate Madison's narrative about weakness and social inadequacy. The audience hung on every word, understanding that they were witnessing the kind of comprehensive character assassination that could define someone's remaining high school experience. Students who had been neutral observers of the ongoing conflict found themselves drawn into the drama, their sympathies and judgments shaping the social consequences that would follow whatever resolution emerged from this confrontation. But Riley's response subverted every expectation that Madison had developed about her target's psychological vulnerabilities. Instead of defensive explanations or emotional reactions, Riley began to speak with calm authority about the principles that governed respectful interaction and the responsibilities that came with power over others. Her words carried philosophical depth that impressed the adults in attendance, while simultaneously challenging Madison's assumptions about intellectual and emotional superiority. Riley spoke about courage and cowardice, about the difference between strength that protected others and power that served only selfish interests, her meaning unmistakable to everyone present. Madison felt her carefully scripted performance beginning to slip away from her control as Riley refused to play the assigned role of victim. The emotional reactions that Madison had counted on to justify her assault were notably absent, replaced by composed responses that made Madison's aggression appear increasingly unreasonable and cruel. The decision to escalate to physical confrontation came from desperation rather than strategic planning, as Madison realized that her usual methods were not producing the desired results. She lunged forward with theatrical aggression, her hands reaching for Riley's clothing in an attempt to recreate the kind of physical humiliation that had proven so effective in the past. But the moment Madison's hands made contact with Riley's GI, everything changed with explosive suddenness. Riley's response was immediate and devastating, her body moving with fluid precision that transformed Madison's aggressive momentum into a perfectly executed shoulder throw that sent the bully flying through the air. The gymnasium erupted in chaos as Madison crashed onto the mat with a sound that echoed throughout the space. Her impact followed immediately by a cry of pain and shock that silenced every conversation in the building. The students in the bleachers rose to their feet as one, their voices creating a cacophony of surprise, excitement, and disbelief that reflected their complete inability to process what they had just witnessed. Riley remained in perfect position as Madison writhed on the mat, her technique having been executed with textbook precision, but sufficient force to ensure that the lesson would be memorable. The quiet girl who had absorbed weeks of systematic harassment had just demonstrated capabilities that redefined everyone's understanding of power dynamics at Riverside High. Chloe's phone captured every moment of Madison's destruction, though the footage would serve very different purposes than originally intended. Instead of documenting Riley's humiliation, she had recorded Madison's complete domination by someone whose skills had been invisible until the moment they were needed most. Amber Walsh froze in shock as she processed the implications of what had just occurred. The carefully planned attack had been turned against them with devastating effectiveness, and the social dynamics that had governed their relationships for years had been fundamentally altered in the space of a few seconds. Madison's cries for help echoed through the gymnasium as she struggled to comprehend how quickly her position of dominance had been destroyed. The physical pain from Riley's throw was severe, but the psychological impact of being so thoroughly overpowered in front of the entire student body was infinitely more devastating. Principal Martinez rushed onto the demonstration area as teachers and staff members moved to restore order to the chaotic scene. But even as adults took control of the immediate situation, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something that would reshape the social landscape of their school permanently. Riley bowed respectfully to her fallen opponent with the formal courtesy that Sensei Kate had taught her, the gesture carrying both traditional respect for a training partner and unmistakable acknowledgement of a lesson that had been delivered with perfect effectiveness. Her demeanor remained calm and controlled, showing none of the satisfaction or aggression that might have been expected from someone who had just achieved such complete victory. The audience gradually processed what they had witnessed, their understanding of Riley Thompson undergoing fundamental revision as they recognized that the quiet girl they had dismissed or ignored possessed skills that made her more formidable than any of them had imagined. The social calculations that govern teenage hierarchies were being rapidly recalculated to account for this new information. Madison's friends and followers found themselves facing a crisis of loyalty and self-preservation, as they realized that their leader had not only been defeated, but humiliated in the most public way possible. The power structure that had protected them for years had been shattered, leaving them vulnerable to consequences they had never had to consider. Sensei Kate approached her student with pride and concern, recognizing that Riley had handled the situation with technical excellence and appropriate restraint, while also understanding that the social consequences of what had just occurred would extend far beyond the gymnasium. The demonstration of judo principles had been perfect, but the real education was just beginning. The video footage that had been intended to document Riley's final destruction instead captured Madison Pierce's complete defeat at the hands of someone whose capabilities she had fatally underestimated. Within minutes, the recordings would begin spreading across social media platforms, ensuring that the lesson would reach audiences far beyond Riverside High School. Riley Thompson had spent 3 years learning to be invisible, but she had just announced her presence in a way that would make her impossible to ignore. The quiet girl who had absorbed systematic harassment without complaint had revealed herself to be one of the most dangerous people in the building, and everyone who had witnessed her demonstration would remember the lesson for the rest of their lives. Madison Pierce had created the perfect stage for her own destruction, and Riley had delivered exactly the kind of education that bullies rarely receive but always deserve. The aftermath of Madison Pierce's spectacular defeat unfolded across Riverside High School like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, each wave carrying consequences that would reshape the social landscape permanently. Within minutes of the gymnasium confrontation, cell phone footage was circulating through every social media platform, capturing not just the moment of Madison's humiliation, but the complete reversal of power that Riley Thompson had engineered. With surgical precision, Principal Martinez found himself managing a crisis that extended far beyond typical school disciplinary issues. The incident had occurred during an official school event, witnessed by hundreds of students and faculty members, and recorded by dozens of devices that were already broadcasting the dramatic confrontation to audiences across the state. The video quality was surprisingly professional, capturing every detail of Riley's flawless technique and Madison's devastating impact with the mat. The emergency meeting that convened in the principal's office 30 minutes after the pep rally included not only the primary participants, but also representatives from the school district, legal counsel, and Sensei Kate as the supervising instructor for the martial arts demonstration. The complexity of the situation required careful navigation of policies regarding student safety, self-defense rights, and the responsibilities of educational institutions to maintain order. Madison Pierce sat in the nurse's office with ice packs applied to various parts of her body, the physical pain from Riley's throw complicated by the psychological trauma of experiencing such complete powerlessness in front of her peers. The girl who had ruled Riverside High through systematic intimidation was struggling to process how quickly her position of dominance had been destroyed by someone she had dismissed as weak and irrelevant. The medical evaluation revealed no serious injuries beyond bruising and strained muscles, but the emotional impact was far more significant. Madison's carefully constructed image of invincibility had been shattered in the most public way possible, leaving her vulnerable to the same kind of social consequences she had inflicted on countless other students throughout her high school career. Her parents arrived at the school within an hour, their initial outrage gradually tempered by the growing realization that their daughter had been the aggressor in a confrontation that had been thoroughly documented by multiple witnesses. Legal implications of pursuing any kind of action against Riley became increasingly complex as lawyers reviewed footage that clearly showed Madison initiating physical contact during what was supposed to be an educational demonstration. Chloe Reynolds faced her own crisis as the social media content she had planned to use for Madison's glorification instead documented her friend's complete humiliation. The footage was spreading beyond her control, shared and reshared by accounts that celebrated Riley's victory rather than sympathizing with Madison's defeat. Her carefully curated online persona as Madison's loyal documentarian was being redefined by circumstances she had never anticipated. Amber Walsh discovered that loyalty to a fallen leader carried significant risks when that leader's power base had been so thoroughly undermined. Students who had previously shown deference to Madison's inner circle were now openly questioning the group's authority and influence. The social protection that Amber had enjoyed through her association with Madison was evaporating as quickly as Madison's reputation itself. Riley Thompson found herself at the center of a transformation that extended far beyond her personal circumstances. The quiet girl who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility had become the most talked about student at Riverside High, though the attention she was receiving was fundamentally different from the negative focus that Madison's harassment campaign had generated. Students who had never spoken to Riley were approaching her with expressions of admiration and respect, sharing their own stories of intimidation and expressing gratitude for someone finally standing up to the systematic bullying that had dominated their school experience. The courage she had demonstrated was inspiring others to speak out about their own experiences with harassment and abuse. Teachers who had previously overlooked Riley's quiet competence were reassessing their understanding of her capabilities and character. The composure she had shown during the confrontation, combined with the technical skill of her response, suggested depths of strength and discipline that had been invisible to casual observation. Several faculty members began reaching out to learn more about her martial arts training and philosophical approach to conflict resolution. Sensei Kate found herself fielding inquiries from parents, students, and community members who wanted to understand more about the training that had produced such an impressive demonstration of self-defense skills. The dojo that had operated quietly in the background of Millbrook's community life was suddenly receiving attention that would transform its enrollment and influence. The conversation with Riley that took place the evening after the pep rally was one of the most important in both their lives. Sensei Kate understood that her student had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed, moving from theoretical understanding of martial arts principles to practical application in high-stakes circumstances. Riley's reflection on the events revealed a level of strategic thinking that impressed even her experienced instructor. The confrontation had not been an emotional reaction to provocation, but a carefully planned response that used Madison's own aggressive momentum against her. Every aspect of the encounter had been anticipated and prepared for, from the timing of the escalation to the specific technique employed. The philosophical discussion that followed explored the responsibilities that came with possessing skills capable of causing significant harm to others. Riley's actions had been legally justified as self-defense, but the broader implications of using martial arts training in social conflicts required careful consideration and ongoing guidance. The investigation that school administrators conducted was thorough and professional, involving interviews with dozens of witnesses and review of multiple video recordings. The evidence overwhelmingly supported Riley's version of events, showing that she had remained calm and non-aggressive until Madison initiated physical contact during what was supposed to be an educational presentation. The disciplinary consequences reflected the complexity of the situation and the clear evidence about who had been the aggressor. Madison received a suspension for disrupting a school event and initiating physical confrontation, while Riley faced no formal punishment for her defensive response. The precedent established by this decision would influence how similar situations were handled in the future. The broader conversation about bullying and harassment that emerged from the incident forced Riverside High to confront systematic problems that had been ignored or minimized for years. Students who had been afraid to report intimidation began coming forward with their experiences, creating a cascade of revelations about the toxic social dynamics that had been allowed to flourish unchecked. Madison's campaign against Riley was revealed to be part of a much larger pattern of systematic harassment that had affected dozens of students over several years. The documentation and testimony that emerged painted a picture of institutional failure to protect vulnerable students from predatory behavior by those with social and economic privilege. The legal ramifications extended beyond school disciplinary measures as several families began exploring civil action against both the perpetrators of harassment and the institution that had failed to prevent it. The video evidence that had been intended to document Riley's humiliation instead provided clear proof of systematic bullying that could support significant financial judgments. Riley's transformation from victim to victor became a source of inspiration for students throughout the district and beyond. The video of her perfect judo throw went viral on social media platforms, generating millions of views and thousands of comments from people who celebrated her courage and skill. Her story became a symbol of the power that comes from refusing to accept victimization passively. The media attention that followed brought opportunities that Riley had never imagined possible. Interview requests came from local and national news outlets interested in her story of overcoming systematic bullying through martial arts training. Speaking opportunities emerged from organizations focused on youth empowerment and anti-bullying initiatives. But Riley's response to her newfound fame reflected the same thoughtful approach that had characterized her response to harassment. Rather than seeking personal glory or revenge against her former tormentors, she focused on using her platform to help other students who were facing similar challenges. Her message emphasized the importance of developing inner strength and finding healthy ways to respond to aggression. The scholarship opportunities that resulted from her visibility exceeded anything she had previously considered possible. Universities, interested in both her academic achievements and her demonstrated character, began reaching out with offers that would transform her educational prospects. The girl who had worried about affording college was suddenly choosing between multiple full-ride opportunities. Madison Pierce's fall from social prominence was as swift and complete as her rise had been gradual and systematic. Students who had previously competed for her attention now avoided association with someone whose methods had been so thoroughly exposed and condemned. The power structure that had protected her for years collapsed as former allies distanced themselves from her toxic influence. The psychological counseling that Madison received as part of her disciplinary process revealed deep-seated insecurities and learned behaviors that had driven her need to dominate and humiliate others. The work required to address these issues would be lengthy and difficult, but it represented the first step toward developing healthier ways of relating to her peers. Chloe Reynolds faced her own reckoning as the content she had created to glorify. Bullying was turned against her by audiences who recognized the cruelty she had documented and celebrated. Her social media accounts, once sources of admiration and influence, became targets of criticism from people who found her behavior reprehensible. Amber Walsh discovered that the physical intimidation skills she had developed in service of Madison's agenda could be redirected toward more positive purposes. The strength and assertiveness that had made her an effective enforcer could also serve to protect vulnerable students from the kind of harassment she had previously helped to perpetrate. The changes at Riverside High extended far beyond the immediate participants in the gymnasium confrontation. The culture of fear and intimidation that had characterized student interactions for years began to shift as people understood that aggressive behavior would no longer be tolerated or ignored by either peers or administrators. New policies and procedures were implemented to address harassment more effectively, including anonymous reporting systems, mandatory training for faculty and staff, and clear consequences for students who engaged in systematic intimidation. The institutional changes represented acknowledgement that the previous approach had failed to protect vulnerable students. Riley's influence on the school's social dynamics continued to grow as she became a model for how to respond to aggression with strength rather than submission. Students who had previously accepted victimization began standing up for themselves and others, creating a cascade of positive changes that affected every aspect of school life. The graduation ceremony that spring carried special significance. For Riley, who delivered the valedictorian address to a crowd that included many people whose lives had been touched by her story. Her speech focused on the power of quiet strength and the importance of using whatever capabilities we possess in service of justice and protection for those who cannot protect themselves. The full-ride scholarship to a prestigious university that Riley accepted came with opportunities to continue her martial arts training at the highest levels while pursuing academic studies in psychology and conflict resolution. Her goal was to develop professional skills that would allow her to help other young people navigate the challenges she had faced. Madison Pierce's transfer to a private school in another state represented both an escape from the consequences of her actions and an opportunity for genuine rehabilitation away from the social dynamics that had enabled her worst behaviors. The fresh start came with requirements for ongoing counseling and community service that would help her develop empathy and accountability. The documentary that was eventually produced about the incident at Riverside High reached national audiences and sparked conversations about bullying, self-defense, and the responsibilities of educational institutions to protect all students. Riley's story became part of a larger movement toward recognizing and addressing systematic harassment in schools across the country. Years later, Riley Thompson's legacy at Riverside High was remembered not just for the dramatic moment when she defended herself against a bully, but for the lasting changes her courage had inspired. The school became a model for anti-bullying programs and student empowerment initiatives that were studied and replicated throughout the educational system. The quiet girl who had spent 3 years learning to be invisible had become impossible to ignore, but more importantly, she had shown an entire generation of students that strength comes not from the ability to intimidate others, but from the courage to stand up for what is right, even when the odds seem impossible to overcome. Madison Pierce had made the mistake of believing that cruelty without consequences could continue indefinitely, but she had encountered someone who understood that there are always consequences for those who prey upon the vulnerable. Sometimes, those consequences come from unexpected sources, delivered with perfect precision by people who have spent years preparing for exactly such moments. The gymnasium at Riverside High School still hosts pep rallies and athletic events, but everyone who was present that November afternoon remembers the day when the social dynamics of their school were permanently altered by a perfect judo throw, and the courage of someone who refused to accept victimization as her destiny. Riley Thompson had learned that sometimes the most important lessons are taught not in classrooms, but in moments of crisis, when the principles we claim to believe are tested by circumstances that demand action rather than theory. Her education was complete, but her real work was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.